I walked through the front door of my own home and felt it immediately. That specific silence that isn't peaceful. It was the kind of quiet that has weight to it, like the air before a tornado touches down. I had been gone for 4 days, a medical conference in Phoenix, the kind I'd attended every year for the past 2 decades as a hospital pharmacist. My feet ached from the flights. I just wanted to sit on my own couch, drink chamomile tea, and call it a night. "Grandma's home," I called out from the entryway, half expecting my granddaughter's footsteps to come running. Nothing. Then my daughter's voice from the living room, "Mom, come sit down." Not "welcome home," not "how was your flight," just "come sit down." I set my rolling bag by the stairs and walked into the living room. They were all there. My daughter, Harriet. No, I'm sorry. I need to start over because that name doesn't belong in this story. Her name was Gwendolyn. My daughter Gwendolyn sat on the far end of the sectional sofa I had paid for, her hands clasped in her lap, not looking at me. Her husband Terence was beside her. My son-in-law, the man I had welcomed into this family, the man whose dental school tuition I had co-signed for, was sitting in my late husband's armchair, his armchair, and next to him, sharing the love seat, was my sister Pauline. My sister Pauline, who lived 40 minutes away, who had no reason to be in my house on a Wednesday evening. "What is this?" I said. My voice came out steadier than I felt. Gwendolyn finally looked up. Her eyes were red, but not from crying, from something harder than tears. Resolve, maybe. Or rehearsal. "Mom, we've been talking," she started. "All of us. And we think it's time to make some changes." "Changes," I repeated. Terence leaned forward and rested his elbows on his knees. He had the practiced expression of a man who had run this scenario in his head many times. "Eleanor, we love you. This isn't coming from a bad place." Eleanor. That's my name. I'm 63 years old, and I've spent the better part of 4 decades being told things aren't coming from a bad place right before someone does something terrible to me. "The house," Gwendolyn said. Her voice dipped. "We've been talking about the house." "My house. The 3-bedroom colonial in Fairfield, Connecticut that I bought in 1994 with the life insurance from my husband Roy's death and 30 years of mortgage payments I made alone. The house where I raised Gwendolyn by myself after Roy passed. The house where I installed the garden beds and refinished the hardwood floors and repainted every single room twice because Gwendolyn kept changing her mind about colors. "Terence's practice is really taking off," Gwendolyn continued. "We need more space. The kids need their own rooms. And you, Mom, you're 63. This house is a lot to maintain alone." "I manage fine." "The gutters," Terence said. "You called me 4 times about the gutters last fall." "Because I was asking for help, not for a takeover." Pauline spoke then, and hearing her voice in that context was like a key turning in a lock I didn't know existed. "Eleanor, honey, nobody's taking anything. We just think it makes more sense for the family, all of us together. Gwendolyn and Terence need the space. You need less stress. We found a beautiful independent living community in Westport. It's very nice. They have activities, transportation. You want to put me in a home?" "It's not a home, it's a community." "I'm 63 years old," I said, "not 83. Mom. And this is my house. My name is on the deed. My money built it. And you 3 are sitting in my living room on a Wednesday night telling me I should move to Westport so Terence can have a bigger office." Terence had the nerve to sigh, actually sigh, like I was being unreasonable. I looked at Pauline, my younger sister, the one I had taken to her prom after our mother got sick, the one I had lent money to, twice, without ever being paid back, The one who cried at my wedding and at Roy's funeral, and who had apparently been sitting in my kitchen behind my back planning my relocation. How long? I asked her. She blinked. What? How long have you been in on this? The pause told me everything. It was maybe 2 seconds, but it stretched wide enough to fall into. We've been worried about you for a while, she said carefully. I stood up. I didn't yell. I didn't throw anything. I looked at the 3 of them, my daughter, my son-in-law, my sister, and I said very quietly, "Get out of my house." Gwendolyn stood up. "Mom, please. You can come back for a real conversation when you want to have one. Tonight, get out." They left. Not without drama, Gwendolyn cried in the driveway. Terence put his hand on her back and shot me a look over his shoulder that I can only describe as calculating. Pauline hugged herself against the October chill and wouldn't meet my eyes. I watched from the front window until the cars pulled away. Then I sat down in the kitchen in the same chair where I had sat 31 years ago when the hospital called to tell me Roy wasn't coming home, and I let myself feel the full weight of what had just happened. They thought I was tired. They thought I was old. They thought that 4 days in Phoenix and a lot of gutters meant I was ready to be managed. They forgot who they were dealing with. I should explain something about myself. I am not a dramatic person. I am not impulsive or vengeful by nature. I spent 22 years as a clinical pharmacist at Hartford Hospital, and before that, I raised a child alone while working rotating shifts and studying for my licensure exam at a kitchen table just like this one. I have dealt with grief and loneliness and bureaucracy and insurance companies. I know how to be patient. I know how to read the fine print. And I know, better than most, that the most dangerous thing you can give a person with those qualities is a reason. They had just given me a reason. The next morning, I called my financial advisor. Her name is Sandra, and yes, that name is on the list, I realized. So let me say, her name is Constance. Constance Bright, 61 years old, 20 years my financial advisor, and the most practical woman I have ever met. I told her what happened. All of it. They want the house, she said when I finished. Apparently. And Terence's practice is doing well? That's what they tell me. I haven't seen the numbers. Constance was quiet for a moment. Eleanor, did Roy have any life insurance beyond the one you used for the house? Yes, there was a secondary policy. I never touched it. It went into a trust for Gwendolyn. She gets it at 65, or when I die, whichever comes first. Another pause. And does Terence know about the trust? I hadn't thought about that. I thought about it now. I mentioned it once. Maybe 3 years ago at Thanksgiving. I said something about Gwendolyn having a cushion when she retired. Constance said. And in that single syllable, I heard everything I needed to hear. It isn't just the house. Of course, it isn't just the house. Terence had been supportive for years in the quiet, strategic way that only becomes visible in retrospect. He was the one who suggested I retire early, at 60, before I was ready. He was the one who framed every conversation about my health as concern, but somehow always circled back to finances. He was the one who had inserted himself into my conversations with my accountant, calling it helping Mom navigate the paperwork. I had led him because I trusted my daughter, because I thought his interest in my affairs was love. Now I was sitting in my kitchen understanding that it was inventory. I asked Constance to pull up everything, every account, every policy, every asset in my name. She did. We spent 3 hours on the phone. The house was worth a great deal more than I realized. Property values in Fairfield had climbed considerably since I'd stopped paying attention. The trust for Gwendolyn was substantial. My retirement accounts were healthy. And there was one thing Terrence didn't know about at all. A brokerage account I had opened in my own name in 2019. Funded quietly over years with a portion of my pharmacy consulting income. Roy had always told me to keep something that was only mine. I hadn't known why at the time. Now I did. "You're in a strong position," Constance said, "as long as nothing changes." "Nothing is changing." "Then what are you going to do?" I looked out the kitchen window at the garden beds I had installed myself the spring after Roy died. The hydrangeas had turned brown for the season, but they'd come back. They always did. "I'm going to find out who else is involved," I said. "And then I'm going to make sure this never happens again." The investigation, and I can only call it that, began with Pauline. My sister and I had always been close the way sisters are when one of them never stops giving and the other never stops needing. I loved her. I genuinely loved her. But love has a way of making you blind to patterns that would be obvious in anyone else. I had been Pauline's emergency contact for 30 years. I had helped her through a bad marriage, a bankruptcy, and a health scare that turned out to be nothing but that cost me 2 weeks of sleep anyway. And somewhere in those 30 years, I had stopped seeing her clearly and started seeing only the person I needed her to be. I drove to her apartment on a Saturday. I didn't call ahead. She came to the door in her bathrobe, looked at me, and immediately went pale. "We need to talk," I said. I was Roy's wife for long enough to know how to say that sentence and mean it. We sat at her kitchen table. She made coffee. Her hands weren't quite steady. "How long has Terrence been talking to you about this?" I asked. She started to say talking about what, and I stopped her with a look. "A few months," she finally admitted. "He called me. He said he was worried about you. That you were isolating, that the house was too much, that Gwendolyn was stressed." "And you believed him?" I believed he loved Gwendolyn. "He does," I said. "That's not the question. The question is whether he loves her enough to be honest, or whether he loves what comes with her." Pauline set her cup down. "Eleanor, he's not a bad person. Tell me what he said, exactly." She did. It took a while. Some of it I expected, some of it I didn't. Terrence had told Pauline that he was concerned about my cognitive sharpness. He had used that phrase specifically. He had told her that I had been confused at a family dinner back in June. I remembered that dinner. I had misremembered the name of a medication once, which is something every human being does, and that he was worried about my ability to manage my own affairs. He had mentioned that as my closest living relative, Gwendolyn should probably have power of attorney, just as a safety net, he'd said, just in case. Pauline had agreed this seemed reasonable. Pauline had also mentioned, in the course of that conversation, the trust. I sat very still. "What did you tell him about the trust?" Her face told me before her words did, just that Roy had left something for Gwendolyn. I didn't know the amount. He asked if Gwendolyn would be okay if something happened to you, and I said yes, Roy had taken care of it. And then he started planning the intervention. She didn't say anything. I drove home. I didn't cry until I got to the end of my street, and then only for a minute. I have a rule about that. 1 minute, then you get back to work. The power of attorney conversation was the thing that scared me most. It's a quiet legal mechanism that sounds like kindness and functions like a trapdoor. Terrence had a license and a practice and a perfectly assembled image of a devoted son-in-law. If he convinced a court that I was declining, if he got a physician to sign off, and there were physicians who did that sort of thing, I had worked in a hospital long enough to know, Everything I had built could be reorganized out of my hands. I had to move first, and I had to be careful. I called my estate attorney. Her name is Vivian. No, it isn't. It's Dorothy. No, both of those are on the list. Her name is Kathleen Ferris, who had drafted my original will in 2005, and whom I had updated it with every few years since. I told her everything. First things first, Kathleen said. Cognitive evaluation. Get one voluntarily now from your own physician and put it in your file. If they try to argue diminished capacity later, you'll have a baseline assessment that predates any claim they make. I did it that week. My doctor of 15 years administered the evaluation herself. I scored, she told me with a small smile, in the top percentile for my age group. We put it in writing, and Kathleen filed a copy. Then we restructured the trust. The trust that Roy had set up for Gwendolyn was real, and it was hers. I didn't touch a dollar of it, but the conditions were adjusted. Gwendolyn would receive it at 65 as planned, but only if she had not, in the preceding 5 years, participated in any legal action challenging my mental competency or my right to manage my own property. Kathleen called it a protective clause. I called it fair. Then I changed my power of attorney, not to Gwendolyn, not to Pauline, to Constance, my financial advisor, with a secondary to Kathleen herself. If I ever truly couldn't manage my own affairs, the people responsible would be women who had never once looked at my property and wondered what it was worth to them. Finally, I had a conversation that had nothing to do with lawyers. I called Gwendolyn. Not to fight, not to deliver verdicts. I called and I said, I'd like to come over for dinner this week, just you and me, without Terence. I want to talk about what happened. She hesitated, but she said yes. We met at her house on a Thursday. She made soup, the kind I taught her, with dill and potato. We sat across from each other at her kitchen table, and I looked at my daughter, really looked at her, and tried to separate what I saw from what I was afraid of. She looked tired. She looked like she had been carrying something heavy for a while. He's under a lot of pressure, she said before I could speak. The practice, the kids, the mortgage. I know how it looked, what we did. I know how it looked, what we did. I know how it must have felt. How did it feel to you? I asked. She was quiet for a long time. It felt like a solution. He kept saying it was a solution, and I was so tired of problems. What problems, Gwen? She looked at her soup. Money. Just money. We're fine, but we're not comfortable. Not the way I thought we'd be. And Terence keeps saying that if we had more space, if the practice had room to grow, if we didn't have to worry about the kids' school, and if you had the house. She didn't answer. If you had the house, and if your father's trust came through early, you'd be comfortable. She started to cry then. Real crying, the kind that doesn't have an audience. I didn't think about it like that. I really didn't. I followed his lead and I shouldn't have. Mom, I'm sorry. I looked at my daughter. She was 41 years old and she still looked, when she cried, exactly like the 7-year-old who cried at Roy's funeral because she understood what it meant and couldn't stop understanding it. I believe you, I said, and I did. Gwendolyn was not the architect of this. She was the door someone had decided to walk through. But I need you to hear something, and I need you to hear it all the way down. I told her. Not everything, not the protective clause, not the power of attorney changes. But enough. I told her what Terence had said to Pauline about my cognitive sharpness. I told her about the power of attorney conversation. I told her what it meant if that had gone forward. She stopped crying somewhere in the middle and went very still. He said that, she said. He actually used those words, cognitive sharpness. That's what Pauline told me. She sat with that for a long time. I didn't rush her. I have to talk to him, she finally said. That's between you and him, I said. But Gwendolyn, I raised you by myself for a long time. I know who you are. And I know that the person who sat on that couch last week is not who you are. So, I need to know, before I walk out that door, which version of you I'm dealing with. She looked at me steadily. The real one, she said. I promise you the real one. I squeezed her hand. I went home. I want to be honest about the weeks that followed, because this is not a story where everything becomes clean and easy. Gwendolyn did talk to Terrence. I don't know exactly what was said, but I know that Pauline called me 2 weeks later to tell me he had called her furious, asking what she had told Eleanor. He had expected the plan to proceed quietly. He had not expected me to talk to anyone. He tried, once, to have a conversation with me directly. He called and said he wanted to clear the air, that there had been a misunderstanding, that he cared about me deeply and only wanted what was best for the family. He used the word family 7 times in 4 minutes. I counted. I told him that I appreciated the call, that I held no grudges, that I hoped we could all move forward. Then I called Kathleen and told her to finalize everything. 3 months later, at Christmas, Gwendolyn brought the kids over to my house. She had filed for a legal separation from Terrence in November. I hadn't asked her to. She had decided on her own, and she had called me the night before she filed to tell me. Not to ask permission, just to tell me. That mattered more than I can explain. Terrence had found out, at some point, about the changes to the estate documents. I don't know how. These things have a way of traveling. He sent me a letter through his own attorney suggesting that the modifications were made under duress and in haste and ought to be reviewed. Kathleen responded in 2 paragraphs. We didn't hear back. The house at Christmas had lights on the porch. I had strung myself. My 2 grandchildren ran through the hall in their socks. Pauline came because I invited her, because she had made a mistake and admitted it, which is more than most people do. We sat in the living room after dinner and the fire was going and my granddaughter fell asleep against my arm, and I sat there in the house I had built, in the chair I had chosen, in the life I had earned, and I felt not triumph exactly, not the sharp, electric satisfaction I had imagined. Something quieter than that, something that felt after 63 years like finally being in a room where all the furniture was mine. Gwendolyn looked across at me while the kids slept. "Are you okay, Mom?" she asked. "I'm better than okay," I said. She nodded, and I saw in her face the same thing I felt. Not happiness exactly, but the particular relief of someone who came very close to losing something they didn't know they had. I have been asked, since then, whether I regret how hard I was, whether I should have been more forgiving sooner, more gracious, more gentle. I think about Roy, who spent 30 years quietly building a safety net for me and died before he could explain why he had done it with such care. I think he knew. I think he understood something about the people who orbit a life built by someone else and wait patiently for the right moment to call it theirs. I am not my late husband's widow. I am not my daughter's mother. I am not my sister's emergency contact, or my son-in-law's strategy, or anyone's asset. I am Eleanor Marsh. I am 63 years old. I own my home outright. I tend my garden in the spring. I go to Phoenix every October. And I am nobody's easy answer. The thing I keep coming back to, even now, is how quiet the room was when they said it. No one was shouting. No one was cruel in the obvious way. They were sitting on my furniture in my house with their voices low and their faces arranged into something that was supposed to look like concern. And that, I think, is how these things actually happen. Not with a door slamming, with a voice saying, "We're just worried about you," while their eyes are already measuring the walls. I spent a lot of years being the kind of woman who made things easy for other people. I smoothed things over. I absorbed the cost. I told myself that was love, and sometimes it was. But I understand now that there is a version of giving that teaches the people around you to expect your compliance the way they expect the lights to come on when they flip the switch. You do it so consistently, so quietly, that they stop seeing it as a choice you're making. They start seeing it as a fact of nature. And when you finally don't, when you sit in your own kitchen and say, "Get out," they look at you like something has gone wrong with the world. What Terence did was calculated. There's no softer word for it. He looked at a woman in her 60s, a woman who had outlasted grief and raised a child alone and built a stable life from difficult materials, and he saw an obstacle with an expiration date. He used my daughter's exhaustion and my sister's loyalty against me, and he almost got away with it. Not because he was particularly clever, but because I had spent so long trusting the people close to me that I had stopped checking whether the trust was deserved. That is the thing I want to say plainly. I was not naive. I was not weak. I was a woman who had decided, consciously, to live with an open hand. The mistake I made was in not understanding that an open hand is not the same as an unguarded one. Integrity, the kind that actually protects you, isn't just about being honest yourself. It's about being honest about what you're looking at, about not letting love become a reason to stop seeing clearly. When I called Constance, when I drove to Pauline's apartment, when I sat across from Kathleen and said, "Restructure it," that was not revenge. That was the accumulated intelligence of a life I had actually lived, finally being applied to my own survival. I had spent decades solving other people's problems. I knew how systems worked, how documents worked, how people revealed themselves when they thought they had already won. I used that knowledge. I was not ashamed of it then, and I am not ashamed of it now. And Gwendolyn, my daughter who made soup and cried honestly and said, "The real one, I promise," she did the hardest thing. She looked at someone she had chosen and decided that choosing him again the same way was something she couldn't do. That took more courage than anything I managed. I had the easier task. I only had to protect myself. She had to dismantle something she had built her life around. None of this was clean. None of it was easy, in the way that satisfying endings in stories are easy. But when my granddaughter fell asleep against my arm at Christmas, in the house I had earned and kept and refused to surrender, I understood something I want to pass along to anyone who is sitting somewhere right now, being told by someone they love that it's time to make themselves smaller. You built what you built with something real, with work, with endurance, with the particular kind of stubborn dignity that doesn't announce itself. That is yours. Not because of a deed or a document, but because of who you had to become to build it. Nobody gets to take that by sitting on your sofa and calling it a family conversation. Know your own worth. Protect it like you earned it, because you did.